and then go live. We will be going live on Facebook in just one moment. Sorry, one moment.
Quiet.
Yes, it is. Sorry.
Nice. I had a busy day at the hemp conference.
Okay, we are live. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We have a special roundtable tonight. Discussions is including Professors Marvin Waterstone and Professor Noam Chomsky. This is an honor for us here for our roundtable number 23. And basically, we're going to start off. We've kind of done our introductions already. So Pearson Crosby, I think you have the first question.
Yes, sir. So I like I said, I have been listening and watching a lot of your interviews lately. I mean, for years now. And I can't help but to hear a dog barking in the background every once in a while. I was wondering your dog's name, Mr. John. What is it?
Well, you got to be more specific.
Oh, is it more than one dog? Recently,
a big one and a little one, and I can spell their names for you, but if I say them, there'll be a rush for the door.
Oh, really?
So gotta be careful. The big one is called GUS, female, and the little one, also female, is, I won't spell the whole name, but we call her PHILLY.
Oh,
You may hear some high-pitched barks, that's from her, or some loud barks, that's from the other one.
that's wonderful.
Amazingly,
I always wondered.
Here's something really amazing about dogs. She knows I'm talking about her, and she just came up to demand to be petted, but she never. It's amazing what they can understand.
Oh, it is absolutely amazing. I have Roscoe and Max here, up here in Alaska, and yeah, Roscoe, yeah, he got away a couple times. He's gone through a lot of stuff, and they're amazing creatures. I trust them with my life and my children's life.
Yeah, they are.
Thank you.
Thank you, Council Member Crosby. We'll get right into it. This question is about Afghanistan. In an August 9th interview, you talked about the withdrawal of Afghanistan and not repeating the mistakes of the Russians. Now that the withdrawal is concluded, quote unquote, what are your thoughts? And this goes to both Professors Waterstone and Chomsky.
Well, why don't you start, Marv?
Well, since the question includes your August 9th interview, why don't you do it? And then I'll say a couple of things afterwards, if you don't mind.
Well, there's so many interviews, I'm not sure which one you're referring to, but I suppose I did have an interview recently where I had an interview last May, maybe it's that one, but there are many more since. In the May interview, I pointed out what was, I thought, pretty obvious, that first of all, I was opposed to the idea of a precipitous withdrawal. I thought that the Afghans, and I don't mean the Afghan government, but the people of Afghanistan should have been brought into consideration to ask what kind of thing they want. And there are many possibilities like local accommodation, something that might be worked out if there was a drawn out period. I pointed out what seemed to me entirely obvious, that if the United States was going to withdraw precipitously, the Afghan government, which is just a mass of corruption, would immediately collapse. They have basically no popular support. And the Afghan army, half of which is just on paper, ghost warriors, so-called, parts of it, parts of it functioning, parts not, they would mostly dissolve. They're not going to, pretty much the way the Iraqi army collapsed when they were faced by actually about 800 jihadis coming at them with pickup trucks and rifles. They see no particular reason to fight their own countrymen, whether they like them or hate them, for the benefit of a foreign occupier. So my assumption was, as I said, that the army would pretty quickly collapse, the government would dissolve, disappear, and what was going to be clear for a long time would happen quickly. It should have had time for agreement and some sort of accommodation. This was inevitable since February 2020, when Trump basically sold out the Afghan people. He made an arrangement saying, tough, we're finished. I make an arrangement with the Taliban. Whatever happens to you is your business. He picked the worst possible time for withdrawal, May, the beginning of the fighting season. Biden delayed it a couple of months, which was a little better, but still, in my opinion, that was not the policy to follow. I think the US had to withdraw, but I think there were better ways to do it. And the consequence of it, I should say that the fact that the prediction turned out to be accurate, but I have a great advantage over the US government. I'm not burdened with intelligence information. So therefore I can just look at what's happening. You guys know much better than I do from your own experience, but there's plenty of evidence that people on the ground know very well what's happening. But as it moves up the level after level of transmission of intelligence, gets modified to what the next level wants to hear. And by the time it gets to the executive branch, it may have very little relation to what's happening on the ground. I know you guys doubtless have a lot more experience with this than I do, but I've observed it in case after case. So if you're not burdened with this, you can see more clearly what's happening.
Maybe just add a couple of words to that. It was actually also very, very clear to those in command in both the civilian and military parts of the structure that this was an unwinnable, untenable operation. And the so-called Afghanistan papers that the Washington Post put out, drawing very explicit parallels to the Pentagon papers, doing something very similar to the Vietnam War, pointed out that many, many officials within both the military establishment and the political establishment knew very well that this was an unwinnable situation. And so the idea that we could have planned a much less chaotic withdrawal, I think, is exactly right. We knew very long ahead that this day was coming, whatever the specific date on the calendar might have been. We knew that it was coming, and we could certainly have done much more to protect the Afghan people. And for the US establishment, embodied in the remarks that Joe Biden made when he was announcing the withdrawal, is that the fault lies with the Afghan military and the Afghan people when he refuses to acknowledge the enormous number of casualties, both within the Afghan military that we propped up, as well as within the civilian population, is just an egregious kind of commentary. But it again, has very long-standing history. This is the kind of thing that the US has done repeatedly, is to enter a place, destroy it, then at some point say, well, we've done what we can, we're going home now. But it would also, I think, be a mistake to characterize, as the media has done almost uniformly, it would be a mistake to characterize this as a complete and inalterable loss. Depending on the metric that one uses, certain elements have made an enormous amount of profit out of that particular enterprise. The Cost of War project at Brown University estimates $2.2 trillion expended in the Afghanistan adventure. And one of the things that's rarely commented upon in the mainstream media or elsewhere is, where did that $2 trillion go? And a huge proportion of it went directly into the pockets of, as we all well know, the military industrial complex, into the arms manufacturers and so forth. And so Afghanistan was not the last, certainly, and it's not over. As you indicated, Etienne, when you put concluded in quotes, it's certainly not over, but in fact has been an enormous trough for those who benefit off of those kinds of adventures in an economic way. It was interesting, Scott Simon on NPR one morning, questioning the withdrawal, said to a person he was interviewing, a congressperson from Ohio, said, I don't know how else to put this, but does America still look like a great power this week? And so that kind of concern, that anguish over the status of the US, rather than any kind of concern for the places that we destroy, is very typical of this adventure.
Thank you for that. Needless to say, it was very much in depth, but can you touch on this, specifically the human consequences of this situation? I know we've talked about it, geopolitically, but the straight human situation that has unfolded and continuing to unfold.
Noam, do you want to start with that?
Well, the situation is maybe uncomfortable, but the situation is reminiscent, highly reminiscent of the late 1980s, something we might want to think about. By the late 1980s, the Russians had more or less put their act together. It was a horrible invasion, killed lots of people, but they pretty well settled things down. They had put in place a reasonably popular government, probably the most popular government that Afghanistan's had for a long time, the Najibullah government. It was controlling the cities, Kabul, Kandahar, others, and instituted circumstances not unlike what the US has finally done under similar conditions. Conditions for women were quite good. They were independent, going to the universities, dressed the way they want. The big problem they had was the Islamic terrorist extremists who the US was funding and arming, who would be coming in and throwing acid in the face of women dressed the wrong way. People like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and his forces, they're now part of the US negotiating team. There was very credible evidence about this coming from leading serious figures, including a woman named Rasil Basu, who's a famous international feminist. She was the organizer of the International Day of Women in 1974 and the late 80s, she was designated by the UN as special to Afghanistan with special responsibility for women's rights. She was writing about this, trying to raise some interest and concern about the fate of women. The US press refused to publish her articles, flatly refused. Even Ms. Magazine, feminist journal, refused to publish her article. The Russians withdrew. The Najibullah government held out for a couple of years, won some pretty big victories. But finally, the Islamists, the US-backed radical Islamists, did take over, practically destroyed Kabul, devastated the rest of the country. It was so horrible that when the Taliban came in a couple of years later, they were mostly welcomed. Well, we can think back about that. I don't think it'll be that bad this time. It's true the radical jihadis are still there, but they're enemies of the Taliban, the Islamic State, Khorasan, the ones that carried out the most recent horrific bombings. The Taliban want to destroy them. That wasn't true in the late 80s, early 90s. There's no one supporting the radical Islamist forces the way the US was supporting them back in the late 80s, early 90s, when they finally managed to overcome the resistance. We want to make sure we don't relive that. So there's not a lot that we can do, but I think we should, first priority is to make sure that we welcome and accept properly the Afghans trying to flee. That's first highest priority. There should be no bureaucratic or other barriers to that. The next thing we should do is lift the sanctions. Those are murderous. They don't affect the leadership. Sanctions don't harm the leadership. That never happens. They harm the population. It's true of the whole history of sanctions. The leadership adapts, and in fact, they even benefit from it. For example, the sanctions against Saddam Hussein in the 90s, which have been studied very carefully, strengthened Saddam Hussein. The population was forced. Population was the ones who were attacked by the sanctions. They were forced to shelter under his umbrella simply for survival. He had a fairly efficient food rationing system. Probably, it may very well have kept him in power. He might very well have been overthrown from within, much as other vicious dictators were. Marcos, Suharto, Duvalier, Ceausescu. But when the population is suffering bitterly and can barely survive, they're not going to overthrow anyone. So it's devastated the population, strengthened the leadership. That's true of sanction regimes quite generally. We should lift the sanctions. The Afghan people need every possible support they can get to overcome the crisis they're in. There's a huge near starvation crisis. We should pressure the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, to release funds. It's under our pressure that they're holding them back. They should be released. We should try to work with neighboring countries to see how effectively the various forces in Afghanistan can get together to put together some viable government. China is the major one. China has a major interest in ensuring that Afghanistan becomes stable and peaceful. China has a major terrorist problem, and in its western provinces, Xinjiang provinces, where the Turkic elements are, they have terrorist bases in Afghanistan, and China wants to make sure that they don't function. So they have a small but functioning border with Afghanistan. Same is true with the Central Asian states. They don't want terrorist forces, Islamic terrorist forces, to arise in Afghanistan, which would threaten them. So the regional powers have an interest in working, same with Russia and India, a little bit more, have a very great interest in this. We can hope to work cooperatively with them with common interests to try to help Afghanistan pull out of the horrible situation it's in. We should also think back a little, ask the question, why did we invade Afghanistan? Why? Go back to October. After 9/11, the US immediately launched a major inquiry, naturally, to try to find out who was responsible for 9/11. They didn't know. 8 months after the US invaded, July 2002, Robert Mueller, the head of the FBI, gave his first major presentation to the press. It was 8 months after the invasion. He said, we assume that 9/11 was probably carried out by Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, but we still have no definitive evidence. Very recently, a Taliban spokesman said that when the US invaded, it didn't know that Al-Qaeda, for sure, that Al-Qaeda was responsible for 9/11. He was bitterly denounced in the press, crazy lunatic, how insane are these Taliban? Only one problem, he was exactly right. In fact, could have been quoting Robert Mueller, head of the FBI, 8 months later. So why did we invade? Well, Afghans have voices. They had an opinion as to why we invaded. Probably the most significant Afghan voice was Abdul Haq, the most respected member of the anti-Taliban Afghan resistance. Anti-Taliban Afghan resistance. He had an interview in October 2001 with one of the leading Middle East specialists, Central Asian specialists, Anatol Yevin, appeared in the British press. I quoted it at the time, couldn't be mentioned here. He said, the Americans are invading because they want to show their muscle and scare everyone. They don't care what's going to happen to the Afghans. They are undermining our efforts to overthrow the Afghans from within, the Taliban regime from within. He was actually supported in a meeting of 1,000 tribal elders who made it across the border to Pakistan, met a couple of weeks later, came out with the same position. Well, that was the position of the anti-Taliban Afghan resistance when we invaded. And it turns out it was the same position as Donald Rumsfeld's. The Taliban, we've just learned that from recently released information, which should have been released 20 years ago. The Taliban offered to surrender. You've probably seen this. Taliban offered to surrender. Rumsfeld, that would mean, of course, giving up bin Laden without any invasion. Rumsfeld said, we don't negotiate surrenders. We're going to come in with force, okay? That's us, me, Rumsfeld. I want to come in, just like Abdul Haq said, I'm going to show our muscle and scare everyone off, okay? That's what happened. The invasion never had to take place. There was never any reason for it. If there was a reason to apprehend bin Laden, police action could have done it. Special forces could have moved into the small area of Western Afghanistan where they were, probably with the cooperation of the Taliban, who wanted to get rid of him. He was a nuisance for them at the time. They didn't want to be attacked by the United States. Could have happened, but it was more important to show our muscle and scare everyone. And no matter what the fate of the Afghans is, those are things that this has yet to be reported in the United States, except by people way out at the fringe, like me. I wrote about it at the time. But all of this was ridiculed, dismissed, ignored. These are things that are worth remembering. We have to learn some lessons too. There's the problem of what we can do for the Afghans in this rotten situation. There's also questions about what we can do for ourselves to learn who we are, what we do, not you and me, not the people of the country, but what our leadership is, what they're working for, what their goals are. I should say this is bipartisan, but important things to understand about our own society.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Waterstone?
I don't want to add anything to that except to say one particular dimension of this, which is always the fact that we use a certain kind of cover to engage in one of these activities. And now we see a lot of hand-wringing in the press about the status of women in Afghanistan, which in fact was one of the covers that we used early on to go in. We never say we're going in to act tough. We don't say it in public in any event. We never say that. So we always have some kind of humanitarian or democracy promoting cover for the activity. And now what we see, again, without really any deep understanding of the status of women in Afghanistan, or without any consultation with women's groups in Afghanistan for the most part, we see again the kind of hand-wringing that always accompanies this sort of moment in US invasion history. So I'll just leave it at that. I think we should probably move to some of the other questions that people have.
Thank you very much, Professor. And yes, we will pivot to another war that is closer to home on our citizens, the war on drugs. I'm going to turn this over to Council Member Alex Popoff.
Thank you, Etienne. This one's for Professor Chomsky as well. Thank you again. Professor, from 1937 until today, you've witnessed the arc of the war on drugs. What are your thoughts on this failed experiment? And to be more specific, among the confluence of challenges, where do you rank the war on drugs relating to cannabis? As a success, as a failure, and just want to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
1937 is a good place to begin, right around that time, days that I can actually remember. But the prohibition ended in the early 1930s. Anslinger and his bureau had no work. They had to find something else to do. So they hit on marijuana. If you look at the drug war, which goes way back, incidentally, much earlier, like why prohibition? It's usually aimed at what are called the dangerous classes, people who are considered dangerous, immigrants, foreigners. Like in the prohibition, it was aimed at poor people, poor immigrants in New York City, the rich people who lived up in Western New York. They could have as much liquor as they wanted, you know, it wasn't a problem. But you got to close the saloons down in New York City where the poor people hang out, beer parlors and so on. Well, what about marijuana? That was smoked by Mexicans and blacks in Harlem. Dangerous people, we got to control them. So it was a very easy target. So Anslinger initiated Senate meetings, which are actually hilarious if you read the records, literally. They managed to get some quack doctors who came in with lunatic stories about what happened to people who took marijuana. They went psychotic, they started climbing the ceiling, they became super powerful demons. And it's funny to, it's sad, but funny to read. So the Senate did agree to, impose harsh constraints. Well, they got into trouble because defense attorneys, smart defense attorneys, realized that they could get their defendants off by claiming that they had taken marijuana. So they were in a psychotic fit, and they didn't know what they were doing when they murdered 3 policemen. Well, government had to react to that, so they modified the story some way, and it goes on from there. There has never been any argument for criminalizing drugs, literally. It's all one craziness after another. The Nixon administration did reinitiate a drug war. Actually, their version was a little more humane than what followed. They did have, it was a terrible idea, but it was more humane than what followed because they at least devoted resources to prevention and treatment. Now, there were, Marv knows much more about this than I do, so he can extend, but just in the RAND Corporation, major research corporation, did a big study of the various devices for dealing with drugs. They found that the best method, with the least cost and the best outcomes was prevention and treatment. So if people are getting addicted, treat them, prevent the addiction. That's the cheapest and most effective method. The next most expensive method was police action, forceful action to criminalize people who were taking drugs. More expensive, less effective. Next up, even more expensive, even less effective, was border controls. Very expensive, had no effect. People got around it all the time. It's not even it's not a trick even. They're doing it right now. The most expensive and the least effective was counterinsurgency, like carrying out fumigation operations in Colombia. I've witnessed that firsthand. I've spent time in southern Colombia in areas which are fumigated, what they call fumigation. It's actually chemical warfare. Planes fly over. The story is they're trying to destroy, opium crops, but they destroy everything else too. The plant, everything, the poor peasants, very poor peasants, indigenous people, Afro-Americans, Afro-Colombians, they try to, some of them, for example, have coffee is a very hard product to sell, very hard. But there were Colombian farmers who found niche markets. Colombian coffee is very high quality. They did find niche markets in Europe where they could sell high quality Colombian coffee, and they could survive on that. Well, as soon as the fumigation comes in, it's the end of high quality coffee. It's all destroyed. So they're done for. You see people, kids with, horrible boils on their arms, people dying, they're living under heavy chemical warfare. Has almost no effect on drug production, and it's very expensive. Well, those are the basic results. Effect, the US consistently follows the least effective, most expensive methods. Nothing happens. Okay, big surprise. Is it a failure? Kind of like what Marv was saying about Afghanistan. It's not a failure for some people, not a failure for those in the drug racket. They do great. Take where we are living in Arizona, one of the exports of Arizona is guns. You can sell guns to the Mexican cartels very easily, make a lot of money. In Arizona, it's very easy to buy guns. I mean, I've never held a gun in my life. I wouldn't know it and how to shoot it, but I could go into a store and buy guns and hand them over to the representative of the Mexican cartel. You know, in fact, Mexico is now suing U.S. gun makers for arming the cartels, which are devastating Mexico. Well, okay, plenty of people are profiting. The drug cartels are profiting greatly. The control of the population has increased. The drug war is a way of controlling the population. It can harm individuals. You all know about it. I happen to know about it too myself. I'm probably one of the only people in the United States who's never smoked pot, never been near it. But my first wife was dying of cancer, lung cancer, 15 years ago. Terrible pain, horrible pain. One of my friends who was a doctor told me the best thing for her would be marijuana, but he couldn't prescribe it because it's illegal. Well, I was able to find somebody who manufactured it on their own and could sneak it to me, could give it to my wife. It relieved her symptoms. It's insane, you know. The whole thing is pure insanity. Now it's getting improved a little, but there's a long way to go. Well, Marv knows much more about this than I do, so why don't you take
Well,
it?
you covered a lot. I just want to add a couple of quick things, one of which you already did to some extent, is to take a little bit of exception to the framing of the question about whether this has been a failure. And Noam enumerated some of the beneficiaries of this. But of course, the other beneficiaries go way back to the beginning of this, prior to 1937. And to think about some of the real targets for that legislation. The real targets initially was not marijuana. The initial targets were hemp, and for completely economic reasons. That is, hemp was a competitor to three major products in the United States at the time, one of which was paper products coming from timber, another which was cotton, which was a mainstay, and the third of which was the emerging area of plastics. And so you have an alignment of very, very powerful economic interests who want to target hemp as a potential competitor to their own products, whether those were timber for paper making, so people like William Randolph Hearst, people interested in the cotton industry, and particularly people in the chemical industry, the petrochemical industry, so the DuPonts, so forth, the Monsantos, who are in the process of developing synthetic products with which hemp would be a major competitor. But you couldn't target hemp particularly. So what happened was, as Noam described, Anslinger and a number of other people, in fact, began to characterize marijuana as exactly the same as hemp. And then it could be racialized in just the way that Noam described. That is, it could be hyperbolically racialized and demonized in the ways that were suggested. And you could go after both hemp and marijuana to target hemp particularly. And so it begins with a kind of economic justification. And if in fact you think about how that actually came out, this was a victory. The other element that I would suggest has been a tremendous success and not a failure of the war on drugs is a misunderstanding right from the start of what it's been about. And if part of the intention of the war of drugs was, as Michelle Alexander describes in her book on the new Jim Crow, if part of the target was in fact the genocide of several generations of particularly young men of color, one way or another, it's been a tremendous success. And on any given day, and this was another question that I saw earlier on about the Sacklers and so forth, on any given day, 450,000 people are in US custody in prisons in one form or another for non-violent drug use. So if in fact you count that as part of the intent, this has been an enormous success. It is not a failure in any way. So I would just sort of leave it at that, but to say that the momentum now is shifting very significantly on this issue. It's only been 25 years since the first state legalized medical marijuana. And that was preceded by basically 60 years of prohibition and demonization. So in the last 25 years, we've seen tremendous progress in terms of people opening up the conversation, for one thing, but now movement even at the federal level, so that the most recent acts that have been introduced, which you guys are completely aware of and supportive of and working to get passed, now not only include decriminalization and legalization, but take on a number of the other elements of the so-called failed war on drugs. So expungement of criminal records, diverting resources to health and safety rather than policing. These things could not have been part of the conversation, basically, even as recently as 15 years ago at the federal level. So the momentum is definitely shifted. And this, I think, is also the case on the international scale. So one of the other questions was about the international treaties that are in effect. And so again, just in the last number of years, we've seen a number of other countries either loosening their laws, realizing the enormous costs, both human, economic, of so-called wars on drugs, and they're changing the kinds of patterns that they're developing. So again, as I say, I would take exception to the framing of the question as the war on drugs being a failure. For certain elements and for certain kinds of ends, it has been an enormous success. It has also provided enormous cover for the kinds of things we were talking about earlier in terms of international invasions, international incursions. We have utilized the war on drugs extensively to arm police forces, to arm militias and paramilitary operations against the populations of particular countries in order to prop up particular kinds of authoritarian regimes under the cover, presumably, of protecting people basically from plants.
Yes, there's no doubt that the industrial prison complex has basically become that complex due to this war on drugs, needless to say. Just a quick follow-up, Professor Chomsky, you stated you knew somebody who had used that medical cannabis. Was that helpful to that person?
Sorry.
You stated you a previous person you knew who had cancer and you had access to medical cannabis. Did it help? Was it helpful? No, I misjudged it. Okay, my apologies.
Yeah, I was able to find someone who illegally at that time was just on their own growing cannabis, and she was able to provide it to me.
And it was helpful.
It was very helpful, reduced the pain. I mean, she was terminal at the point, so, but it did reduce the pain in the last couple of weeks.
Thank you. I'd be remiss not to follow up with that. I'm going to Councilmember Armstrong to follow up on another question.
Yes, again, I'd like to thank you gentlemen for being with us tonight. Professor Chomsky, you've stated that you prefer to live in the real world when seeking solutions to alleviate suffering, oppression, and violence. Based on what you've seen of our work, are we on the right path to accomplish this in our chosen field?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand the question.
Okay, so you've recently stated that you prefer to live in the real world when seeking solutions to alleviate suffering, oppression, and violence. Based on what you've seen of what we do and what we've done, are we on the right path to accomplish this in our chosen field?
By we, you mean your
The
group?
Veterans Action Council, us.
Exactly. That's exactly what should be done. Should have been done a long time ago. If it had been done, for example, could have saved my wife huge amount of pain and suffering. That's not the only case. So yes, this whole system has to be dismantled. There are some pretty interesting groups. You probably know LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Great group of people, former police officers, judges, others. The head of it happened to be a close personal friend. He was a guy who spent 25 years on the New Jersey State Police, and was decided that this whole drug business was total insanity, and pretty much for the reasons that Marv was talking about. And he organized a very good group. And these people are pretty credible because they're, senior officers of the police, state police, some judges, and they've had people in Congress do listen to them. That's been one of the several prongs of the effort to try to dismantle this disgraceful system.
Professor Waterstone?
Yeah, as I said to you when I met with a number of you the other day, you also have a kind of status in the society, a kind of legitimacy. At least rhetorically, we support our troops, not always materially, but sometimes materially, but we definitely support our troops rhetorically. So I think the case that you make is a very compelling kind of case. That is the personal stories that you tell, but those stories are framed within a kind of legitimated status in society that I think gives you a real leg up when you're speaking either to legislators or to other groups that might not otherwise listen to other advocates for cannabis reform. And so I think your ability to take advantage of that and think about the momentum of this particular instant is something that I think can move this debate forward, and it's clearly happening. I think one of the major pieces of legislation that was just either introduced or reintroduced includes, because I think of your advocacy, the very compelling element that the Department of Veteran Affairs should be able to prescribe medical cannabis in a uniform way. And I don't mean that in a pun, a uniform way, but in any event, should be able to prescribe this across the country so that veterans who, as I say, can claim this kind of privileged, legitimate status, can access this equitably, so that people don't face very different kind of either bureaucratic or economic or political consequences as they have to move from state to state. So I think the fact that that's a plank in these major pieces of legislation speaks to the fact that you have a certain kind of credibility to move this conversation forward. And I think it's inevitable. And part of the reason it's inevitable is to go back to following the dollars. That is, the tax revenues are irresistible to state and local governments in these exigent times. And that alone has moved the needle enormously. But I think I said this the other day, I don't think this is going to come about for humanitarian or altruistic reasons. It's going to come about in large measure because as soon as the federal government steps back and deschedules cannabis, marijuana, big pharma and big ag are waiting in the wings to take advantage of this in every way that they can. And so they're going to be pushing this along, and they'll be pushing it as satisfying public interest. The public opinion has shifted dramatically on legalization in the last 10 to 12 years. So I think they're waiting in the wings. They're waiting for the Safe Banking Act to be pushed forward so that people can engage in financial transactions like any other business. And the projections are within the next 3 to 4 or 5 years, this would be nearly a $50 billion a year industry. So I think that's going to push things along as quickly as anything else. But the beneficiaries might not be only those people who stand to make lots of money. People can, in fact, benefit from the therapeutics that the research element of this would also open up. That is, it's long past time to have a sort of evidence-based conversation about marijuana, which never occurred in the 1920s and 30s before prohibition set in. Never took place. So the idea that this is something that's been around for thousands of years, used therapeutically, used recreationally, or in adult use, is something that we should be able to open up and investigate as a society and come to some rational conclusions about it.
Thank you, professors. As you have both touched on, work internationally and the war on drugs. Our council member, Michael Krawitz, has been working at the United Nations level and helped change the international law just recently to get cannabis out of Schedule 4. And he's going to follow up with our next questions. Council member Krawitz.
Thank you, Etienne. Professors, hopefully just went quiet on my end, but hopefully it's just a glitch. So this is a question about the geopolitics of cannabis policy and really sort of seeking advice. As Etienne pointed out, I've been working at this for a while, started working on international policy back in the mid 1990s and went to the United Nations meeting in 1998 was the first meeting that we went to. And basically just having a very small team inside the UN working on this all the way along. And Veterans Action Council has now joined that team about a year ago, has really been immersed in all this very steep learning curve to get caught up on everything. My perspective has changed quite a bit from when I started out. I really looked at it from the perspective that when the United States was ready to change, that the United States had been such a strong driving force in the world drug war, that when the United States was ready to change, essentially that would be a driving force in changing the policy around the world. And, recognizing there's 186 countries that signed on to this treaty, we actually, as Etienne pointed out, we actually found a little window back around 2015. We went over to the World Health Organization and we were able to exploit an opportunity to reschedule cannabis based on the science and evidence through the World Health Organization process. That had its limitations, as the World Health Organization even admitted that cannabis really should be taken out of the schedules completely, but that would be not schedule change, that would be rewriting the treaty. I looked at it, back those years that the United States would be ready to do that. We would essentially just lead the change and we would change the treaty. It really doesn't look that way anymore, from especially the input that we've listened to at these hearings in the last year or so from all these different countries. They're actually giving testimony that sounds like Anslinger and Hearst wrote it back in the 30s, and they are acting like it's theirs, like they came up with it brand new. So it's really an uphill battle worldwide that we're kind of entering into. And again, we're this little team, but we're part of this team at the United Nations, kind of representing the entire world on this issue and just really trying to figure out the best strategy to move forward and write a blueprint, if we can, on how to get the world out of the trenches of prohibition. So we're kind of looking for any advice on how you would approach this, or that you could guide our approach.
I don't really know all the ins and outs of the treaties themselves. Hang on just 1 minute. Noam, would you take this for a second? I'll turn this thing off.
Actually, I'm sure you know a lot more about it than I do, so I don't feel that I can give advice. But the U.S. has plenty of clout at the UN. It does whatever it wants. I mean, if the United States wants something to pass, everyone's going to agree with it. And if the United States wants something blocked, it'll stop. We should recognize that the U.S. has overwhelming power. We see this all over. You see it, for example, in the sanctions regime. So, for example, the world is 100% opposed to most of the U.S. sanctions, but they can't do a thing about it. So Europe doesn't want to obey the Iran sanctions. They never have, but they have to obey, because the US can literally just throw them out of the international financial system. So same with Cuba. The last vote at the UN was 184-2, opposed to the US sanctions on embargo, actually, on Cuba. But the US just disregards it. And if the US does take the lead on this, can achieve a lot. I'm suspicious, just from the few things I know, not a lot. For one thing, among the beneficiaries, I think, are major banks. When the UN has looked into illegal drug flows, turns out plenty of it comes from US banks, which are evidently involved in the illegal drug trade and benefiting from it. And that's a big part of the US economy. If you look at the geopolitics point I think Marv mentioned, the country that, there's one country I've been pretty closely involved with for 40 years, that's Colombia. As I said, I've been there a number of times in the poor areas, know many of the people. Colombia has what has been called a genocidal democracy. Father Javier Giraldo, very brave priest, one of the people who fights against it, an old friend, wrote a book about it. The US, for the United States, it's a major base in Latin America. It's one of the bases that the US uses for control of the region. And one of the ways it does it is by supporting the drug trade. The government is intense, has always been a major drug producer. They blame the peasants, but who do the peasants sell to? No, they can't sell drugs to the United States. It goes through the governmental agencies. There are guerrilla movements, the peasant-based movements that the United States has wanted to destroy. This goes far back to John F. Kennedy, who sent a mission in 1962 to Colombia, which advised what he called paramilitary terror against known communist supporters. Communist is a word that means, a priest working with peasants, a human rights activist, anything like that. And it's led to horrendous human rights violations. Right now, for example, there are enormous protests taking place in Colombia against the government, against its repression, against the violence against peasants. It doesn't get reported, but far beyond anything that's been reported in Cuba. Well, this is a major interest for the United States and for US interests in the drug business, finance, banks and others, and simply in control of the region. Is the US going to give that up? I think it'll take a lot of pressure from, as Marv said, people like you are in a very powerful position to do things about this because of your well-deserved credibility, which somebody like me say it doesn't have. I think you can use that as a lever. I think it's going to be a struggle to get the United States to lead the way on international dismantling of the whole disgusting, depraved drug system.
I'll just add a couple of words to that. And part of it, maybe to sort of flip the question for you a little bit and think about just sort of tactically and pragmatically how much a group like yours can begin to accomplish. I mean, I think the intent to transform this conversation on a global scale is commendable. But your group is called the Veterans Action Council, but you're not veterans of everywhere. And in fact, the status that you have that gives you a certain kind of credibility and legitimacy in the US may work, in fact, counterproductively on the world stage. Not everyone has viewed US military personnel with a great deal of approval. So I would ask you to think a little bit about how much you can accomplish as a group, and where you really have very legitimate kind of credibility and status, and where you don't. But beyond that, I would also suggest that if you are able in some ways to move the conversation in the US, and the US adopts a very different kind of policy posture, it's very difficult to predict what that might unleash as a new imaginary for people thinking about this set of issues. And so rather than your group necessarily having to push this transformation at the global stage, simply working at the level where you have the most leverage and the most impact might produce a result that itself then engenders very different conversations around the world. But I think Noam is right, that there are a number, many places that are very, very happy with the current status quo, that the war on drugs is a cover for all kinds of shenanigans and authoritarian activities that may not necessarily disappear, but would have to find a new cover if that did disappear. So I would simply ask you to think very carefully about why it is you want to operate both at the national and at the international scale, rather than devoting the most of your energy, as I think you actually do, at the scale where you have the most influence.
Sorry, but I have to leave for a medical appointment for my dogs.
We appreciate your time, Professor Chomsky. We ran over our time for sure. We'll continue the conversation with Professor Waterstone if that's okay. We appreciate you for your time. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you today, sir.
Sorry, I have to leave.
No problem.
Thank you, sir.
I have 15 minutes left.
No problem. We will be within that time limit for sure. Going on to Council Member Kowalski.
Oh, Mr. Waterstone, thanks again for joining us. My question is, the Medical Industrial Complex, a recent bankruptcy court ruling holding Purdue Pharma liable for the opioid epidemic, provides the Sackler family cartel immunity for civil liberty. What are the odds of bringing them before the world body to account for their crimes against humanity?
Yeah, again, a very, very big question. The judgment that was reached has, of course, encountered all kinds of legal criticism in one way or another. And the judge in the case, Judge Drain, actually specified that the Sacklers are still potentially subject to criminal liability. So as your question articulates, the judgment, if it is in fact put in place, the settlement, the bankruptcy settlement, protects the Sacklers from civil liability, but not necessarily criminal liability. And so there are a whole number of jurisdictions that are waiting in the wings to possibly prosecute that avenue, including up to the federal level, that the Biden administration, the Justice Department, could pursue the Sacklers for criminal liability. Whether or not they could be taken to The Hague, something I think that's really impossible to speculate on at this point. I think if you think about the very long list of potential criminals against humanity who have not been taken to The Hague, the Sacklers are probably way down on the list, even though they've caused unbelievable hardship and atrocious calamity. The figure that I gave a little bit ago about the number of incarcerated people comes in the context of people like the Sacklers walking free. That is, that many of the people who are in that 450,000 on any given day are themselves the absolute result of Sackler opioid crisis, the Sackler-induced opioid crisis, who have now been caught up in the legal web and are themselves incarcerated. So the fact that the Sacklers will walk free is really itself a crime against humanity. The $4.5 billion settlement, which of course always sounds like a great deal, is really walking around money for the Sacklers. It's to be paid out over 10 years. And the estimates are that they profited to the tune of between 11 and $20 billion just from the opioid crisis, not to mention other elements of Purdue Pharma. So I would say the chances of bringing them to The Hague are very slim, but the chances of many jurisdictions from the federal level on down through state and local governments who have suffered the consequences of the opioid crisis, the chances of them being pursued in a criminal prosecution are a bit higher. I wouldn't get overly optimistic about it, but I'd say those chances are higher than bringing them to the Hague.
Thank you, Professor Waterstone. That was, needless to say, eloquently answered. And as were this entire discussion, I want to thank all of our council members for showing up today. And I definitely want to thank Professors Chomsky and, of course, you, Mr. Waterstone. You have been an amazing wealth of knowledge, and we'd love to welcome you back anytime for any discussions. Mr. Councilmember Krawitz has a question.
I really wanted to just follow up really quick, Professor. Your astute comment about international activism and the veterans' perspective, or rather the perspective of veterans from different countries, I think is really important. And it brings up a topic I've never really talked about in these forums. So I just want to talk about it for a second. Veterans for medical for Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access has been working for years. And then, of course, Veterans Action Council has joined last year into a team that's been working since, like I said, since 1997. I came into that working really just solely from the leadership of the cannabis movement in the United States, but quickly met up with the leadership of the movement worldwide. And there is a serious vacuum of leadership at the worldwide level. And it's really something. I mean, you go to Congress and there's plenty of people there. You go one step above and there's almost nobody there. It's really a vacuum. But our team is comprised of activists from all over the world, literally from South Africa all the way to Australia, going the other way, you know, if you know what I mean, and everywhere in between. And also I want to mention that the Veterans Action Council has in its tent veterans from Australia, from Israel, from Ukraine, from Austria, etc. So really, it's been a lot of fun to meet with veterans from around the world and to learn the different perspectives. But we are really just at this level, at the international level, we're just team players. We're not really doing it as a veterans action like the stuff that we do in Congress or in the States so much. But you know, within the United States, looking backwards, we're certainly taking advantage of our veteran status. But yes, we're very careful in how we present ourselves worldwide, and we're there as observers at the UN. You know, we have the ability to enter in with badges, and you know, we try to be polite. But thank you.
No, I appreciate that, and it's clear that you've had some effect there. I mean, the WHO ruling, you know, is actually a very important step. But as I say, I mean, I think your group has a particular credibility within the jurisdiction where you operate. And I would simply encourage you to use that leverage to the extent possible, and recognize just a number of the obstacles at the international level over which you have little control.
You know, those are wise words, and we will take those to mind, and we shall heed those warnings, needless to say. Your advice is sage, and we appreciate it greatly. And as stated, please come back anytime. We'd be more than honored to have you and Professor Chomsky, you alone, doesn't matter, We appreciate your mind and what you do, and thank you for shaping future minds and continuing to shape future minds to critically think and challenge the dominant paradigm.
Well,
All right.
pleasure to be with you, and I'm honored to be here today.
All right. Well, with that, we're going to wrap up for today. I'd like to thank the Veterans Action Council again and all of its members. It's been an amazing discussion, and one that I won't ever forget. But it's been a pleasure and an honor, and we thank you all for coming. Have a great rest of your night.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.